الكرام برحب بحضراتكم معانا. للي منكم كان متابع فعالية مهمة جدا كانت موجودة في شرم الشيخ منذ أيام، وهي الاجتماعات السنوية لبنك التنمية الأفريقي. التركيز كان بشكل كبير جدا بطبيعة الحال على التنمية في أفريقيا، لكن التركيز كان بشكل أكبر على التصدي والتغلب وتمويل ما له علاقة بتغير المناخ من حيث التكيف والتأقلم والتعايش والتصدي لهذا التحدي الكبير اللي بدأ للأسف الشديد يعني تأثيراته تبقى واضحة جدا على الدول الأفريقية من حيث التصحر والجفاف والهجرة الداخلية والخارجية أيضا من أفريقيا. في هذا الإطار الحقيقة هذه الفعالية كانت فعالية مهمة جدا، حضرها مجموعة كبيرة جدا من السادة المسؤولين من مختلف دول العالم على مستوى رؤساء البنوك المركزية والسادة الوزراء من مختلف دول العالم، وكانت المملكة المتحدة بريطانيا كانت حاضرة من خلال ضيفي العزيز اللي كان مشارك في هذه الفعالية الهامة، واللي هنعرف من خلال لقائنا معاه ايه اوجه او اطر التعاون ما بين المملكة المتحدة ومصر في هذه القضية، ايه التمويل المرشود للتنمية في افريقيا للتغلب والتصدي لقضية تغير المناخ. كل ده هنعرفه من خلال ضيفي العزيز وزير الدولة البريطاني للتنمية والشؤون الافريقية السيد أندرو ميتشاو. Your Excellency, thank you so much for your time and it's a pleasure meeting you today.
And meeting you too. It's wonderful to be back in Cairo.
Thank you so much. Let's start with a couple of days ago, Sharm el-Sheikh was witnessing the African Development Bank Group's 2023 annual meeting, and definitely the focus was about development in Africa, especially when it comes to combating the challenge of climate change. With your presence in that event, how do you see the challenges versus the opportunities regarding the development in Africa?
Well, it was a very important conference. The Africa Development Bank is probably the principal mover of financing for climate change across Africa, and also for funding projects which will lead to the reduction of poverty and need and scarcity. And the Africa Development Bank is extremely strong in those areas, and it was a chance for all of us who are supporters and shareholders and investors in the Africa Development Bank to drive forward that agenda. And Britain has always been a very close partner of the bank, and in a whole series of different ways I was able to make the point at the governors' meetings yesterday that Britain was one of the leading shareholders and investors, and that we were determined to drive forward these various African agendas. Britain operates in partnership not only with the bank but with many countries in Africa. Egypt is an incredibly close partner of the United Kingdom, and we have a very common objective. And actually, if you want to see the closeness of Britain and Egypt, you see it in the fact that we had the COP in Glasgow 2 years ago, and then the COP in Egypt.
COP 26 and 27 in Sharm el-Sheikh.
One year ago. So that has meant that on a whole series of very important investment issues and climate change issues, Britain and Egypt are very close indeed.
Yeah, and definitely the cooperation between Egypt and the UK is amazing, and it has been very strong on the road from Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh regarding the COP from 26 to 27, and all the way through up until the conference. The challenge is mainly financing, funding to Africa that is paying a lot because of climate change, from drought to migration, and a lot of challenges are present, desertification and so forth. So do you believe that still the funding is still the biggest challenge up until now, especially when we heard huge, humongous numbers like one of the numbers I've heard that Africa needs from 2020 to 2023, $2.7 trillion in terms of development regarding climate change. So do you think funding is still the challenge, the biggest challenge up until now?
Well, it certainly is one of the biggest challenges, although things are moving in that direction. And let's be clear, if you had all the money tomorrow, you then need to make sure that there is a focus on which are the key projects. I don't think at the moment we have enough, a pipeline of enough oven-ready projects, particularly in climate adaptation, which is further behind than mitigation, I think we can say. And so trying to make sure that you've got those projects ready, and also that poor countries in in Africa, for example, Somalia, which has very limited capacity to access that money for those projects, that they have the technical expertise supporting them so that there's a level playing field, if you like, level ground on who has access to the money. So we mustn't neglect that. That's an important issue, but you're right in saying that money is at the centre of all of this. And I would say this, that first of all, through the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, and the Bridgetown agenda, this is about how you turn billions of dollars into trillions of dollars for climate change. It's about how you advance the objectives that we saw in the Egyptian COP last year at Sharm el-Sheikh and in Glasgow in Britain the year before. And Britain is one of the leading countries in the multilateral system. That means the World Bank and the African Development Bank, in trying to use their balance sheets better to get more money out of it. And we have used significantly guarantees. We have produced very significant guarantees for the African Development Bank, and those guarantees enable the bank to produce some of this money that is required. Yeah. But the issue for us is how we turn billions into trillions. Work is going on that. The African Development Bank is one of the crucial entities, not least because they have invented some of these mechanisms to do with insurance, to do with the guarantee principle. All of these things make a huge difference to the amount of money that is available for tackling climate change across Africa. And I was in Niger not long ago, and I saw for myself what climate change is doing, desertification, taking out arable land to the tune every day of 500 football pitches. That is a huge loss of agricultural capacity, and it's hitting the poorest countries in the world first and hardest. And that is why this agenda is so important.
So that is good, but in terms of development, and if you may allow me, I would like you to talk more about the UK and Egypt cooperation in terms of development, and then I'll go and take it further to talk about Africa. So in terms of the cooperation between Egypt and the UK, are there like new projects on the pipeline for the time being, or what's going on? Especially that the cooperation is very strong since Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh, and definitely before that.
It is very strong, and it's going on, if you like, at a macro level as well as at a smaller and more specific level. At a macro level, we are working very closely together with the World Bank to ensure that there is a real increase in capacity for Egypt, and as one of the principal shareholders and people driving the World Bank through, Britain is very much on Egypt's side and trying to make sure that there's more finance available. But when I was in Sharm el-Sheikh yesterday, I had an opportunity of launching a particular project under the Room to Run arrangement. The Room to Run arrangement is an arrangement whereby Britain has produced $2 billion of guarantees for the African Development Bank to use on a number of specific projects, half of them to do with climate adaptation, half of them to do with climate mitigation. That full amount of money to be dispersed by 2027, so it's pretty immediate. And we launched a great project to do with water, together with one of my colleagues, the Egyptian minister. We launched this project north of Cairo to provide water for something like 5 million people, 70,000 acres of irrigation, £70 million out of that, one of the first projects to come out of the Room to Run, and it will have a real impact on people's lives. And we work closely with Egypt, British companies particularly working with Egyptian companies and with the Egyptian government. And above all, perhaps, it is the organisation called British International Investment, BII, which is the British taxpayers' private sector investment vehicle, and it invests billions of pounds across Africa. It does some stuff that is very upfront and pioneer, for example, like supporting port development in Somalia, which is quite a sort of frontier activity to take part in. But interestingly, if you look at the effect of those investments on the ground in Africa, it means that BII effectively is providing providing employment for about 1 million people. That's food on 1 million tables, but also their investments are paying a lot of tax as well into countries' treasuries. And so if you look at that, you see that over the last 5 years, the taxation paid through these investments is something like $10,000 million. And so this investment vehicle, galvanizing the private sector, galvanizing, for example, pension funds, African pooled local currency funds. This has a huge impact on development. And BII is probably the leading development finance institution in the world. It works together with the African Development Bank, it works with the World Bank, it works with the Egyptian government, the Egyptian private sector, having real effect in terms of development. So I would cite that a project for water, so important, that we announced yesterday, as a very good immediate example on the back of these wider, very significant investments that we are making.
Yeah, but that project, is it different than the other project called لها and معها?
Well, that's for her and with her. And that is a £2 million project, which Britain is supporting through our taxpayers' funding. And it's a great project organised by the British Embassy in Cairo, working with civil society to promote women's rights. And, you know, in Britain and in many countries, we see that the rights of women are being rolled back across the world. It's not just in Afghanistan. We saw it in the decision of the Supreme Court in America last year. And we think that advancing the rights of women is incredibly important. It's at the heart of our objectives, working with our partners in countries like Egypt to secure the rights of women. And what does that mean? It means that women should be able to go to school. It means that women should be able to decide for themselves whether and when they have children. And it also means bearing down on the terrible violence that comes out of conflict, which attacks women. We had a very big conference organised by my colleague, foreign minister in Britain, very well known in Egypt, Lord Tariq Ahmed, who was in charge of organising this conference across the world to try and bear down on violence against women, particularly in conflict, and make clear that we should all regard this as absolutely abhorrent.
So actually those 3 pillars are the main pillars for لها and معها in general?
So Britain, those are the 3 areas which Britain prioritises in all aspects of our work on development. It is the rights of women, which are being rolled back across the world. And we focus particularly on getting girls into school, making sure that women can choose for themselves whether and when they have children, and also focusing on violence against women. And there was a very big conference last year in Britain, led by my colleague Lord Tariq Ahmed, who's very well known here, in order to bear down on violence against women. Now, this specific project, which is going to take place over the next couple of years, supported heavily by the British taxpayer. We're going to invest something like £2 million in this, run out of the British Embassy in Cairo, focuses specifically on domestic violence and violence against women. And it is going to work on that one of the 3 pillars, working to help empower women to stop domestic violence and also to help survivors of it. And we are very proud of this aspect. We should, all of us, be working across all societies for the rights of women. And just as we focus on this area in Britain, we're looking forward to working with our counterparts here in Egypt to promote the rights of women, and in particular to bear down on domestic violence and the suffering it causes.
Great. So from Egypt, let's go back to Africa, and the challenge regarding climate change is humongous. We see this in Somalia, in Kenya, in Uganda, in East Africa. And if I'm talking about East Africa, as far as I remember, that you announced a new package of humanitarian support for East Africa a couple of days ago. How much is the fund, and what exactly is being funded regarding the development projects in these countries in East Africa?
So we know that the biggest humanitarian crisis, I mean, we'll have to park Sudan just for a moment on this point, but we know that the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world is taking place in the Horn of Africa. And Britain has been a leader in terms of working out how to tackle these crises. And of course, they bear on your point about climate change, because when these crises occur, it's very important not just to address the humanitarian need, but also to address the resilience and climate adaptation need, because if you do that, it means that when these crises strike again, as inevitably they will, there is greater resilience in the system for people to resist the effects of it. And whether it's ensuring that if you're bringing water by lorry into areas where there is great suffering, the next time there's a drought in that area, you want to make sure that there's irrigation, that there's water retention through reservoirs and so forth. So all of that is very important as well. But this was a conference in New York yesterday, which Britain was co-hosting, designed to focus on this need of what, as I say, is one of the greatest humanitarian crises in the world, and to ensure that money is available. And Britain made a pledge of about $150 million. And on humanitarian spend, we always keep our eye on changing circumstances. We have also announced that next year we will be spending something like $1 billion on humanitarian need, and much of that will be focused in Africa, and much of it will be focused also in the Horn of Africa. And we are hoping later this year also to have a specific meeting in London, a food summit, which will look at starvation and malnutrition, and how through technology as well as through other mechanisms you can try and stop the enormous numbers of children particularly who go to bed hungry at night, which calls on the conscience of all of us to try and get that changed.
Great. That in terms of development, and especially when we're talking about climate change and the importance of adaptation and resilience and mitigation, that is very important. But let's talk about the bigger picture of development and investing in Africa. And that will take us to a very important conference, the UK-Africa Summit. If I go back to 2020, because 2021 and 2022, it was virtual due to the COVID and the restrictions. So as you are preparing for the UK-Africa Summit next April in 2024, what are the main pillars that you are preparing for during that conference, and what were the advantages you have noticed from the past summits?
Well, it's an extremely important conference. As you rightly say, it's happened before. Our Prime Minister has invited around 25 African countries, which are big partners of Britain, none less so than Egypt, and he has written to the President and said how very much he hopes he may be able to lead a team to that investment summit next April. Now, if you look back, you can see that the last summits have produced billions of pounds in investment, and it starts now because companies are meeting, focused on that summit. They are meeting and talking about what can be done. But the result last time was that billions of pounds of investment took place, billions of pounds of deals were organised actually at the conference itself, but equally billions in the run-up to the conference, a huge amount of trading deals, big increase in trade between different countries, and in particular between Britain and African countries, and also an enormous number of jobs created, which is what in many ways this is all about, helping people to elevate their economic and social condition.
Yeah, and we don't have exact numbers regarding those things.
Well, I think that, I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars. I think something like $6 billion were created in the run-up, and even more money was put on the table actually at the conference. So it's very, very significant sums. But of course, it's not only about people coming to the summit and doing deals. It's also about meeting organizations like BII, which I described, and that generates more and more deals as well. So it will be a huge opportunity, for example, for Egypt, attending with business people, politicians, people from government, meeting whoever they want in whatever sector, whatever type of business, and driving forward business development, jobs, and the economies to the benefit of all of us.
Mm-hmm. Well, Egypt is ready and is willing to have a lot of investments at the time being. So here, if we're talking about the UK side, is the UK ready to invest a lot through either different companies, NGOs and stuff like that, in terms of development with all the pillars of development?
Well, if you look at all those pillars, you look at the investment that we are seeking to procure from the World Bank, for Egypt. If you look at the work of the African Development Bank, where Britain is leading, such as the project we announced last night in water. You look at the investment of BII, the billions of dollars being invested across the country, but here particularly in Egypt, which is a leading country for BII. I think you'll be hard put to find any other country that has got a bigger investment stock than Britain has overall in Egypt. And we're very proud of that cooperation, and it's only getting more, and it's only getting closer, and it's to the huge advantage of both our countries.
Getting back to the African issues, when we were talking about the humanitarian crisis, you mentioned a couple of countries, and I mentioned some, like Somalia, like Kenya, like Uganda, and then you said Sudan, but we'll talk about Sudan. And I know why, because if we're talking about humanitarian crisis, it became huge and humongous and bigger in Sudan. So in terms of that, with what Sudan is suffering from now, what are your programs for support for Sudan?
Well, we are hoping that there can be a sustained ceasefire so that the humanitarian workers can get back in and deliver much needed support to people who are suffering both within Sudan, but also across the borders. Britain has provided £5 million, £2.5 million to help those who've been driven across the border into Chad, but also to help those who have returned to South Sudan and been driven across that border. 18 humanitarian workers have been murdered so far, so we need an environment in which they can operate. But at the end of the day, the critical point here is that there needs to be a cessation of violence. The soldiers need to return to barracks, and they need to have a political track. This is what Egypt and Britain and other countries are supporting, a political track to go back to where we were on April the 11th, when we were talking about a return of civilian government in Sudan. We need a situation where we have the military in the right place in society and the civilian government in the right place. And it is urgent that that work proceeds, because if it doesn't, there's going to be enormous humanitarian need and disorder across a very large part of the region, and we're going to see the fears about food scarcity, starvation, humanitarian need on health, education, or slugging it out in Khartoum and across Sudan.
And unfortunately, we're seeing these challenges happening now. Food scarcity, children are not going to school, water scarcity, healthcare scarcity. So the problems are huge now, and the crises are huge in Sudan, unfortunately.
They are. And while we have to get a humanitarian agreement and a ceasefire, that is only part of the problem. We need to get back to the political track that was evident on April the 11th. It wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. As I say, we need the soldiers to return to barracks. We need the generals to lay down their arms, and a return to that civilian process about a new government that is civilian-led, with the right place in society for the army, but the right place also for the civilian leadership.
Well, I hope that the ceasefire could survive and no one starts firing back, for the humanitarian support to start taking place, because Sudanese people are in deep need for the support with all the crisis and the scarcity that they have in different resources. Hopefully when we meet the next time, things are better in Sudan, and development is great in terms of the cooperation between the UK and the African countries in general, and the UK and Egypt in general, and hopefully we meet in the UK-Africa Summit in April 2024.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
And Egypt and Britain are working very closely on Sudan. We need urgently to get to a better place, and I pray that we will do.
Hopefully soon. Your Excellency, Minister Andrew Mitchell, thank you so much for your time. Been a great pleasure, and looking forward to our next interview, hopefully.
Me too. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.